Hello and welcome to the Maloney Pines Bible Study class. My name is Heather McKee and I'm very pleased to be with you today and welcome you to our study of Luke chapter 6 verses 27 through 36. And let's begin with prayer. Loving and gracious God, you give us breath, you give us life, you give us the strength of mind and the openness of heart to encounter difficult texts and to learn and hopefully grow from wrestling with challenging concepts. We ask that you open our hearts today as we engage in discussion and deliberation and reflection on your word through your Son Jesus Christ. We ask that you be with all of those who are struggling today, for those who are encountering difficulties, whether they be economic, issues with health, housing, or any stumbling block they may have in front of them. We ask that you give your wisdom to those in leadership positions in our country and around the world as they hopefully work to find solutions to vexing problems that impact us all. Be with our families, our communities in the coming months as we strive for peace and justice. And we ask all of this in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. So in reflecting on this particular text for today, a memory came up for me. When I was in seminary, as is true with almost everyone I know who's gone to seminary, we do field education placements. And many times those are, working as a youth leader in a church or perhaps as a hospital chaplain. But one of the field placement opportunities I had was to work as a chaplain in a shelter for victims of domestic violence. And I still vividly remember that experience. I was at Princeton Theological Seminary, which is situated in a beautiful part of southern New Jersey. And the shelter I worked at was in northern New Jersey, and literally was within sight of a pre-9/11 Manhattan. So as I would drive to this location, which was undisclosed for the safety of those there, I could see the Twin Towers coming into view as I went into this rather industrial, grimy type neighborhood. And I had just was in the process of finishing my second year at seminary, and was, in all honesty, woefully unprepared for the task ahead of me. Fortunately, I had studied a little bit of pastoral theology and took one course that I think was especially important for me in that particular context, and read a book entitled Christianity, Patriarchy, and Abuse, which was edited by Joanne Carlson Brown and Carol Bone. And in that collection of essays that I read prior to taking my field ed placement, I was struck by one particular quote of one of the essayists by essayist Marie Fortune, who said, "God is not only not the cause of injustice and suffering, but is instead the source of righteous anger at persons or circumstances that do cause suffering, as well as our source of compassion for those who suffer. So as I approached this text, I was reminded of that experience and some of the things that I learned about the struggle it takes to love your enemy and what that means in a practical sense. And I want to spend our time together looking at some of these challenges and hearing the voices of some biblical scholars and theologians who've wrestled with them in real world contexts. So let's go ahead and get started, and I'm going to read our text for today. And again, it's Luke 6, verses 26 through 37. So, but I say to you that listen, love your enemies, do good to those that hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Give to everyone who begs from you, and if anyone takes away from you, do not ask for them again. Do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. If you lend to those from whom you hope to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much again. But love your enemies, do good, and lend, expecting nothing in return. Your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High. For he is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. So these words of Jesus are situated in the Gospel of Luke and in the context of what is often called the Sermon on the Plain. If you remember in Matthew, there's a Sermon on the Mount. So these are similarly situated messages that here in Luke, the author has placed on the plain. And I thought we'd spend a little bit of time looking at the context of that particular text. Prior to Jesus speaking these words, Jesus had been up on the mountain. And going back to verse 12, we know now during those days, he went out to the mountain to pray. And he spent the night in prayer to God. And then when he came down, he called his disciples and chose 12 of them, whom he also named apostles. So Jesus had been engaged in prayer, in a spiritual exercise, in something where he was away from his disciples and that narrowing down here down to apostles. And he was also away from a great crowd of disciples and multitudes of people from all Judea, Jerusalem, and the coast of Tyre and Sidon. So we have a picture here of Jesus who has been in prayer alone, coming down to those who have been following him, his disciples, and also a wider group of people who maybe we could say are Jesus curious. Maybe they've heard that he's a great healer, because we know Jesus has done that before in this narrative. And they're curious as to what does this man have to say to us? What is the secret to this movement and this spiritual power? So Jesus comes and stands in front of them in this great multitude. And like in Matthew, actually starts with what in Matthew are called the Beatitudes. But in Luke, we have the blesseds as well, but we also have the woes. And so Jesus is setting up those who are blessed. Blessed are the poor. Blessed are those who hunger now. Blessed are those who weep now. Blessed are you when people hate you. And then setting up a contrast, but woe to you who are rich. Woe to you who are full now. Woe to you who are laughing now, for you will mourn and weep. So we have Jesus addressing this audience that's comprised of both people who have been part of his group, his disciples, and now he has set aside a special group of 12, the apostles, and others who have been following him now. So that's the audience within the text. But when we think about when this gospel was likely written, it's written probably between 80 and 110 AD. The audience for the writing for Luke's writing was probably more of a predominantly Gentile audience as opposed to Matthew, who scholars believe wrote for more of a Jewish audience. So Luke's message is going out to folks who probably didn't have a background in Judaism, but yet were still in the Roman Empire. And it's likely that they were not elite members of that society either. Probably they too were poorer, probably suffered injustices and oppression due to the empire and Roman rule in the areas in which they lived. So there's a bit of a parallel between the audience in the text and quite probably the audience that would have heard these words from Luke. So there could have been a strong identification by the hearers of the text with the actual audiences within the text. And that's important, and we'll get into that a little bit as we go along. But looking at just the actual words within here, there's a lot of rich theological language that in many cases I think we've done a disservice by glossing over. And the first word that I want to just unpack a bit as we get started is the word love. And I'm sure many of you know that in Greek there are several words for love, the eros, philios, and in this context the Greek word is agape. And agape is not a sentiment, not a feeling, not an expression of affection, as we would say when we would say, oh, we love X, or, you know, we are in love. It doesn't have that connotation in the Greek. And we'll talk a little bit more about that word when I bring up theologian Paul Tillich. But first I wanted to introduce you to what our Reformed theology forebearer John Calvin had to say about this particular text. So I'm going to read to you his take on it. Calvin says, "Do not resist evil. There are two ways of resisting. The one by warding off injury through inoffensive conduct, and the other by retaliation. Though Christ does not permit his people to repel violence by violence, yet he does not forbid them to endeavor to avoid an unjust attack. So, he forbids them to render evil for evil, but does not say in any way, shape, or form that a Christian must court a violent encounter. So Calvin certainly was not setting up Christians to voluntarily suffer without thinking through the implications, or, as we'll discuss later, as a means to overtake or reject evil. So Paul Tillich is a 20th century theologian who was originally from Germany and was brought over to the United States during the time when Hitler was coming to power. And Tillich wrote a wonderful little book called Love, Power, and Justice. And in that book he undertakes the task of unpacking what those words mean in the context of a Christian ethic. And I want to just distill a couple of ideas that Tillich has about those three words. The first, Tillich describes love as a constant movement toward reunion. And in this way, love finds itself united with compulsory elements of power in order to destroy what is against love. So, Tillich is connecting love and power, and goes on to say, for power, the idea of compulsion plays a huge role. Every manifestation of power, Tillich says, possesses some form of compulsion. Until it goes on to say why force and compulsion are necessarily actualizations of power. And he goes on to say that that power is not only exerted in an exterior fashion, but also in an interior way in self-control. So bringing that triad together, Tillich says that justice is the form in which power of being actualizes itself under the principle of love, and that it is grounded in the essential claim of all beings, that all are beings as opposed to things, and that justice is violated when the intrinsic claim is disregarded and when another's power is rejected. So Tillich states that justice preserves what love unites, and that justice is the form in which and through love performs its work, and the channel through which compulsion and force of power of love is necessarily directed. So Tillich's understanding of agape cannot be separated from power and justice, that the three operate in almost a Trinitarian fashion. And looking at ways that has happened over the course of history, one needn't, as far as Tillich is concerned, look any further than his own context, which was Nazi Germany. And Tillich said, "It is never the nation which is directly guilty for what is done by the nation. It is always the ruling group. But all individuals in a nation are responsible for the existence of a ruling group. Not many individuals in Germany are guilty of Nazi atrocities, but all of them are responsible for the acceptance of a government which was willing and able to do such things. Those who represent the power of a social group are a representative, but not an actual senator, a center. A group is not a person." So looking back at the text, the very first line in verse 27 says, "But I say to you that listen." That first line really struck my ear because it sets up a difficult teaching. And there are other places in the Gospel of Luke and in Matthew too, where a teaching is framed for those of you that will hear, for those of you that will listen. And for me, that kind of is a foreshadowing of something really difficult to come. And we've talked a bit about the audience for these words. These were oppressed people, the poor, ones that did not have institutional power, but yet had to survive within unjust systems. So I want to take just a couple minutes to look at one of the commonly, I think, misused little phrases in this text, and that is to turn the other cheek. Many scholars now look at that as almost a humiliating act. If you think about the context of the Roman Empire and that period of time in the ancient Near East, where it was not uncommon for superiors to strike subordinates. And that was perfectly fine, unfortunately, as a means of discipline and to gain attention. But everybody was right-handed because the left hand was used for other less hygienic purposes. So to strike someone on the cheek and then turn would require a backhand blow. And to give a backhand blow would be considered a humiliating act by someone in a superior or place of power and authority against someone of lesser status. So Jesus is being cagey and being smart and understanding the power structure of the culture that he's in to give these less empowered people a way of retaining their humanity and standing their ground, knowing that for them to respond with violence would mean annihilation. And so we see that over and over again in this text of Jesus teaching non-violent tactics, how to endure, how to maintain their own humanity in the face of a power structure that and individuals who represent that, who are not identifying that humanity within them. In fact, American biblical scholar and theologian Walter Wink has written quite extensively about what he sees as Jesus' teachings of creative nonviolence. And to this particular text, and he says that to this proud but subjugated people, Jesus does not counsel revolt. One does not befriend the soldier, draw him aside, and drive a knife into his ribs. Jesus was keenly aware of the futility of armed revolt against the Roman imperial, and minced no words about it, though it must have cost him support from revolutionary factions. And I think that's important because, as we know, in the wars that happened in Palestine that led to the second destruction of the temple in AD 70, there were violent revolts, but they usually led to the massacre of the folks that were revolting against them. But then Wink goes on to say that neither does Jesus want to dehumanize the oppressors. Wink says, there is admittedly the danger of using nonviolence as a tactic of revenge and humiliation. But, he goes on to say, there is also at the opposite extreme an equal danger of sentimentality and softness that confuses the uncompromising love of Jesus with being nice. So, what Wink gathers from Jesus' teachings here is that this is not a doormat. This is not being submissive. This is about truly those who have spirit, for those who do not have access to the power structures of the world, to begin to understand their own spiritual power to overcome injustice. And I want to talk a little bit further about some of these tactics that Wink recognizes in these texts, and he calls them Jesus' third way. And they are to seize the moral initiative, find creative alternatives to violence, assert your own humanity and dignity as a person, to meet force with ridicule or humor, to break the cycle of humiliation, to refuse to submit or accept an inferior position, and expose the injustice of a system. Stand your ground and be willing to suffer rather than retaliate, such that the oppressor will come to see you in a new light. So let us pray. Loving and gracious God, we give you thanks. We give you thanks for the power of your word. We give you thanks that we can participate in justice, in bringing about justice and healing, and bringing about unity through right relationship, that we too are heirs to the love that you so vividly showed to those who would dispute you and who would seek to destroy your work here on earth. We ask that you be with us and that you guide our feet and that you give us the strength to be hearers and listeners and doers of your word in the world. Amen.